Welcome to After the Homily with Father Daniel Scheidt. I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. Have you ever had questions after the homily? I know that I have. Why did Father talk about this topic or that topic, and why didn't he talk about something else? Do you ever wish that you could just sit down with your priest and talk about a list of things that didn't make it into the homily? Well, this is the podcast for you. We'll cover everything from church literature to church architecture. And it doesn't matter if you're a everyday or a Christmas and Easter, or I can't remember the last time I went to Mass Catholic. We're here for you, and this podcast is for you. Father Daniel Scheidt is the pastor of St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Father Dan, it's good to be back.
Great to be here.
This is the next episode, the second in line, as we talk about the election, or before the election, not after it. So maybe before we get into sort of the meat of today's episode, we should recap a little bit about Plato's cave and where we left things with the last episode.
Yes. Many people have many questions about what's coming up for the future of our nation, who the elected officials who would be best to serve the good of our republic would be, and how to discern that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the purpose of this series of podcasts is to provide some helpful foundational discernment. And the first step that we took, the initial podcast on the election, was the realization that before any election is outside of ourselves, for us to choose somebody other than ourselves, the primordial election that we live from, that's most important, is our own being elected, chosen by God to exercise nothing less than our citizenship of heaven on this earth, that is to be in the world, but not of the world. And being in the world is to make proposals from the heart of our faith, from the heart of the church, for the life of the world. So Christianity is intimately personal, and but it is not for that private. So it's meant to be lived socially, proposed socially. And in the first podcast, when we talked about Plato's cave in his famous book, The Republic, it was just as a way of meditating on the fact that there are all sorts of voices, so-called authorities, all sorts of influence groups all over the place on the whole political spectrum that are trying to persuade us that what they are proposing is the definitive focus. And thousands of years ago, this was recognized as illusory. So the goal of the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is relentlessly, constantly to be about the business of attempting to transcend what the culture proposers are offering to us. And this is everything from news channels, blogs, governmental agencies and branches of government, party platforms, et cetera, et cetera.
And you had some very specific advice in the last episode having to do with the amount of information most of us consume in that realm.
Yes, to take our news consumption, and certainly for the next few months, cut it by 90%. So if we spend 90 minutes a day consuming news, let's take it down to 10 minutes, which of course will get us thinking more intentionally about how to best use those 10 minutes. And then with the remaining time, to dedicate it to our relationship with the Lord and cultivating our own relationship with Him, and asking the Lord for us to see through how we may be being manipulated by any number of groups, so that we're really living from uh, the Lord's uh, the Lord's gift of vision for us. Jesus is the philosopher of philosophers in the sense of not only being the lover of wisdom, but wisdom incarnate, wisdom in our flesh, God made man. And so by spending 90% of the time that we would spend consuming ordinary news with consuming the good news, that is to say, the gospel, and to be looking not primarily at the gadgets, the cell phone, the television, the computer, but literally Jesus in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament. Come to the oratory of St. Mary Magdalene, perpetual adoration. For us to be devoting that time sitting at the feet of the good news himself, that's going to sharpen and deepen and clarify our decisions made for the good of the Republic.
I think most people, if they were to say, I need to do some preparation for the upcoming election, they wouldn't necessarily say, so I better rush down to the Adoration Chapel.
Yeah, I mean, for most people, the instinct is, well, yeah, of course, I'm going to pray against all the people I don't want to win, and I'm going to pray for the people I do want to win.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, who wouldn't do that? But that is inadequate. That is, quite frankly, superficial.
Yeah.
If we aren't primarily in dialogue with the Lord about the bigger picture for our lives, our families, our nation, the world, if that isn't the fruit of our contemplative prayer, then we are going to be running around like chickens with our head cut off, and we are going to be more susceptible to being manipulated by very powerful cultural and anti-cultural forces.
I mean, it certainly feels like today, the dialogue, there really is no dialogue.
Right.
That it's really rhetoric, and it quickly devolves into anger and
Yeah, and
calling.
let's just cut to the chase. So why does Plato, a pre-Christian philosopher, see even all of those years back that most people, most of the time, are just in chains, fixated on these images being projected onto their life by other people, especially influencers? Like, why is that? Well, those who wield worldly power often use desire, fear, and anger as the drivers to get people to do what they want. Because if I'm enslaved to my desires, whatever the desires are, I'm more manipulable. I'm more susceptible to being led one way rather than the other. If I'm afraid, I'm also more susceptible to being manipulated by somebody, for example, who's going to be offering easy security. And perhaps the most dangerous for the political life of a nation, those people who are best able to stimulate anger, even if it's righteous anger, and there is a value to righteous anger, but anger is like fire, and if it's not given a form, it threatens to burn the whole house down. And there are some people who want to burn the whole house down. So with anger, what's being stimulated is the fight or flight instinct. And so when I'm really angry, I'm not thinking rationally. I'm thinking, how can I either eliminate my would-be enemy or flee from my would-be enemy? And people who, again, are constantly peddling the baser desires, pleasures, fears, and anger are are true demagogues in the sense of manipulators of the demos, of the people, rather than servants of the public good.
Mm. So, last episode, to summarize, we said decrease consumption by 90%.
Yes.
Realize that you're watching shadows, and develop a desire to know more and to understand better.
Yes.
And you gave a little
From sitting at the foot of the Lord.
Yeah.
And then within that, those witnesses who are living a really integrated life, who don't seem to be as swayed by the froth of the currents on the surface, but who are living a deeply integrated life, and to get one's news from a variety of sources. And I don't mean a variety of sources on a certain spectrum. So like, well, in addition to watching Fox News, watch MSNBC. But rather, we are at a certain advantage in our time that in addition to the televised so-called news, which tends to focus on images and sound bites, there are, for example, podcasts by any number of people who can explore issues in much more depth and with much more variety of starting points for observation than is often allowed through the cultural, the media filters. But I also think that the study of the Word of God, the study of the tradition of the church, especially when it comes to Catholic social teaching, these are vital sources of discernment that we can consider perhaps in another podcast. So everything we've set up to now just has to do with our nourishing of our own contemplative life in the presence of the Lord and the Lord's friends, and living from our own election. Today I was hoping to shift to an attempt to understand where other people are coming from. And those people may agree with us. We may share their political views, even their deeply held principles, or we may not agree with them. We may disagree with them vehemently. But how can we actually make the attempt in justice and in charity to understand where other people are coming from?
And I noticed you didn't say change their minds.
We have not yet approached how to persuade.
Yeah, we're simply trying to understand.
Yes. So this is a step-by-step podcast. And again, we could have done this another way. We could have said, all right, this is the podcast to persuade all of the people who are so foolish that they don't have
This is not a voting apologetics.
No, not.
But
no.
It's interesting that you said understand, because that's different. That's more of a mission. And you have to want to understand the other person, because if you understand the other person's view, if it's not your view, even, I guess it is your view, there's going to be connection.
Guess what, Dr. Stroud? There is going to be, all things being equal, a November 7th, which is to say, we are going to be living with the people who voted the same way we did, and the people who did not vote the same way we did. So we are going to have to live with other people who have very, very strong disagreements. And what I am not proposing is some kind of least common denominator, suck it up tolerance, got to put up with everybody. But rather, Christian charity actually demands that we seek to understand where our interlocutors are coming from. And let me just take the example of St. Thomas Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Catholic intellects, one of the greatest human thinkers who's ever lived, when the universities were being conceived from the heart of the church during his time, and when he was exercising his role as a teacher in these universities, he would always start by articulating the claims of his opponents
Oh.
first. That's how he'd begin. And he would actually do it with greater sympathy and more rigor than they themselves articulated their positions. And only after articulating their positions did he respond point by point to the aspects of those that could be affirmed and the aspects that needed correction. So that desire to find what is good in the position of another person, and only on the basis of that to offer whatever corrective needs to be offered, that strikes me as something necessary in our life, in engaging with other people.
So how does one begin this journey of understanding?
Yes. So just as with the first podcast, I invited our listeners, our viewers, to read Plato's Republic, the little excerpt about the allegory, the story of the cave. The recommendation for this podcast, it's a much more formidable recommendation, is to read a book by a social psychologist, Jonathon Haidt. He's about as secular can be, so he's not coming at this from a Christian standpoint. But he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And I found this book so helpful at just understanding some starting points. We might even call them pre-rational starting points that we all have, and that groups of people have. So it's not only certain dispositions of myself as one person, but also some bases for why I would be drawn to certain groups of people, and actually repelled by other groups of people. And maybe by way of a distinction, I can help us enter this discussion. And it's the distinction between values and principles. So in our culture, in 21st century America, the word values is often overemphasized because values refer to my preferences, maybe not fully articulated, but some of them very, very deeply held, what I privilege over other things. So you have your values, I have my values. And left to itself, that leads us down the rabbit hole of subjectivism. There's no way out. You value vanilla, I value chocolate. Who's to say? Who's to say whether vanilla should have priority over chocolate or vice versa? Contrast that with principles. So principles, rather than being located in the subject, what the subject prioritizes, that's values. Principles are objective criteria of discernment that I can appeal to, and you can appeal to help us discern our way forward together.
What might an example of a principle be?
So when in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson proposes that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it would be a principle that all men are created equal. Now, we would have to explore, well, what does he mean by men? Does that include men and women? Does that include all people? We have to ask, well, what does equality mean?
Sure.
But that would be a principle that we could explore together.
Yeah.
And then he articulates 3 rights, and we could also think of each of those rights in a certain way as a principle. The principle that human life has an intrinsic value to it. Its value is not simply the sum total of what other people ascribe to it, or liberty, freedom, has an intrinsic value. It's valuable in and of itself, regardless of whether I want to give you freedom or not, or even whether you want your freedom. So that whole discourse would send us into the direction of principles. And later, in a different podcast, I actually do want to have a discussion about principles of discerning one candidate over another. But before we get to that, I actually do want to spend this episode on understanding how it is that other people would have different values, why they would be more sensitive to certain aspects of our life together, and why other people would have different sensitivities and preoccupations.
Because to understand would be to connect. And there's
Exactly.
There's hope for movement there and for relationship.
In any democracy that depends on government involving the so-called will of the people, it presupposes a social context in which we are committed to living together, and that certain decisions that are made as a group are made in such a way that they shape our common life. Without that, it does degenerate pretty quickly into the rule of the strongest over the weakest. It becomes exploitative very quickly.
Well, this principle of majority rule is actually rather false, isn't it? Because 51% could vote to destroy the other 49. We wouldn't. Right. A civilized society wouldn't allow that. So it's not really majority.
Yeah, and that's why the founders of the United States, when the Constitution was written, James Madison, for example, deliberately designed the separation of powers among the legislative, the executive, the judicial branches to be a check, to slow down, to impede the pretensions, the will to domination of the other branches. So it was actually structured into the genetics of the United States government that for example, no president would be able to wield kingly or queenly power.
Sure.
No legislature would be able to become a tyranny of the majority. The fact that amendments to the Constitution have to go through such a rigorous process, requiring far more than just 51% to be passed. That way of structuring our life is actually meant over time to create the accumulation of the wisdom of tradition. So the very movements in the Republic now to just, well, I think we're just going to need to burn the house down to rebuild. That is antithetical to everything that the founders considered necessary for good, stable government of any kind.
So one is encountering another one with whom that one disagrees, has different values, maybe different principles, but different values.
Yes.
How does one begin this journey of understanding?
Well, and I'm not going to give a book report. This whole thing is really just teeing it up for. You could think of this podcast as an infomercial for Jonathon Haidt's book.
Well, now you have 90% more time too.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
This is what you
Exactly.
spend it.
You could turn the podcast off right now and just go to the book, or I'm sure it's on audio, so you can listen to it. But Jonathon Haidt has laid out 6. We can call them pre-rational foci, pre-rational things that people are more or less attentive to. And as he lays them out, one is the continuum of care versus harm. So when you look at the human race, there's a spectrum of people who on the one end are much more sensitive to caring for other people in general, but even caring for strangers. And there are other people at the other end of that continuum that really are less attentive. We could even go so far as to say that really don't care about, for example, people other than themselves. And again, we're not ascribing some kind of overarching moral judgment here. We're just saying that among the billions of people who've ever existed, there are certain people who are more temperamentally disposed to focus on or sensitive to caring for other people, especially people who are oppressed, who have suffered some harm. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is a focus on liberty or freedom, especially liberty or freedom from oppression. So they're going to be at one end of the spectrum. People, I just want to be free. I want to be free of this constraint, that constraint. I want to liberate people who are being oppressed by this person or this system. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum are the people who are actually just content, really don't feel desire to have lots and lots more freedom, are actually rather happy just being secure in what they do have. Okay. Again, no overarching moral judgment here. It's just there's a spectrum of people among the billions on the planet. Third one, if you're still following, a real sensitivity to fairness, and especially when there's cheating involved. So
kind of a justice.
Making sure that if you get 2 apples, I get 2 apples. Whereas other people, at the other end of the spectrum, they're not as interested in everybody being treated fairly because, maybe you just want 1 apple and I want 2 apples. And I'm not going to be overly concerned with you getting your second apple. Whereas other people, and you can visualize these people in your mind who, scrupulous fairness.
So far, you're describing my in-laws and family
Well,
members.
That's
Everyone's
the
family
beautiful
members, yeah.
thing, and again, the infomercial is The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathon Haidt, is actually so that we can see with fresh eyes and actually some empirical research where people are coming from
Yeah.
and maybe why. We have three more. We're in the home stretch.
Mm.
The fourth spectrum that would concern what people focus on, what they're more sensitive to, is loyalty and betrayal.
Oh, sure.
So there are certain people who are deeply, deeply concerned with their own loyalty to another person, to one's country. And there are other people who are less so. Maybe they're in it for themselves. And I don't just want to put egoists at the other end of the spectrum, but there are some people who are going to be more sensitive to, for example, only keeping those people around themselves who are loyal, versus people who are interested in a variety of different perspectives. You think of like Abraham Lincoln with his cabinet. He deliberately chose people who differed from him. You think of Dante, for example, who at the very pit of hell put betrayers. So the most evil people in Dante's epic poem were the traitors. Two more. The spectrum of authority and subversion. So there are certain people who are more attentive to authority than others. In fact, who value authority as absolutely necessary for anything else to take place in society. So, in our country, we have a history of being critical of authority. So in other countries, you criticize the leader, you have jail time. So think Vladimir Putin's Russia, for example, or priests and bishops in Nicaragua. They're just jailed or expelled. But that criticism of authority, so the other end of that spectrum is subversion. There are some people who are constantly seeking to put a check on authority or to work against authority. Teenagers, as they emerge into adulthood, there's something very, very deep that wants to test itself against authority. And then the final one, perhaps the most mysterious, is labeled by Jonathon Haidt as sanctity and degradation. So some people are more sensitive to the sacred, to what is revered or reverable as of God, as transcendent, and other people just don't have as much or any of that sensitivity. And so there are some people actually who are dedicated to just overcoming that. So, most, I guess, recently, infamously, you would have the float at the Paris Olympics, where the Last Supper is depicted, as a drag show, and all of the sacred persons, the sacred events of other people are deliberately degraded. And so, what this book? Oh, have I The title is The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathon Haidt. He's simply exploring how different groups, and he does examine what he calls liberals, he examines what he calls libertarians, and he examines what he calls social conservatives. So he's very careful that this isn't simply collapsible into the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but just he's talking about groups of people whose sensitivities are going to be different.
And isn't it fair to say, because I'm sure viewers might be questioning, we define it by the extremes, but people are going to be somewhere on those continuums.
Every single person.
Right.
Every single person. And again, this is not determinative, by the way, of how to vote. So this podcast isn't about, the authority subversion, that starting point is where we need to start versus the care harm one. It's just saying that these are often pre-rational and in some cases actually really highly developed grouping priorities for why people pursue what they pursue, with whom they pursue it, and against whom they pursue it. So this whole podcast is just getting us to understand where people are coming from. And I guess the test of whether somebody needs this podcast is if somebody thinks the person with whom I disagree is just an ignorant fool, is just so benighted, so head under a rock, so far gone that I don't even know where they're coming from.
This might be
it's actually important. And so I don't want to give away too much, but just to encourage our viewers.
What strikes me as interesting, because you referenced the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, it seems like in all of those spectrum, one way or the other, you could say those are rather uniquely American sort of traits. And in one way or another, all of us are genetically related to those people. And so you could argue it's almost built into our DNA to a degree.
Oh, yeah. This is a fascinating discussion because our country, unlike most, dare we say all, but let's just stick with most. Our country, United States of America, unlike most countries in the history of the world, is founded by people from all over the planet, coming from all these different backgrounds, and they're dedicating themselves not to a bloodline, but actually to an idea. Again, that all men are created equal, and so have an equal say in their governance, and it is an experiment, and the jury is still out how long this thing's going to last, under what conditions it can last, and
because we're brand new.
Yeah, we're brand new, but there is in the American genetics, the American political genetics, a kind of anti-authoritarian instinct. And so that just needs to be recognized for what it is. So when Jonathon Haidt talks about the sensitivity of what he would call liberals, they would be most sensitive to the care harm
sort of access.
Continuum. Yep. And they would also be less sensitive, but still sensitive to the liberty and oppression. So what he would call their most sacred value is the care for victims of oppression.
Sure.
And to a certain extent, fairness is there, but Underdeveloped, as he would put it, in terms of sensitivities would be the loyalty betrayal, the authority subversion, and the sanctity degradation continuum. So the focus is very much on care, harm, liberty, oppression, fairness, cheating. Now, with the libertarian, that shifts, as one might imagine, to the focus being almost exclusively on liberty, oppression. So I am in it for the maximization of freedom. Also, a little bit of the continuum of fairness and cheating. But the other four sensitivities are relatively underdeveloped, like care, especially for those who've suffered harm. You know what? Each one of us, we're pursuing our freedom. The loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, and degradation would be underdeveloped sensitivities. Now, the most fascinating, I find, Jonathon Haidt admits that he's liberal by temperament. So he just lays down the cards. This is where I'm coming from. And his empirical research actually demonstrated to him, and he admits this, that the social conservative moral matrix is actually the most complex and the most variegated in attending to the different sensitivities. And so he points out the most sacred value for the social conservative is the preservation of the institutions and traditions that sustain a moral community. And so he makes the claim, it resonates with me, that all six of those continua are operative as sensitivities in the social conservative. So care, liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity. There's an attempt to try to keep all of those together in a moral community. And so the reason we don't burn the house down, we don't overthrow the government, we don't burn the police station down, for example, is because we're not going to redress harm, oppression, cheating, betrayal, subversion, and degradation without creating a moral community. So anyway, the wonderful thing about the book is that it has pictures, and the pictures are hilarious. And it's bumper stickers about all of the different sensitivities. And I solemnly assure you, if you read the book, you'll just be nodding and even laughing at, oh yeah, that's where that person's coming from. Like that's what they're leading off with. That's what they're proposing.
What do you think it is about us that makes us so want to be around people that think just like us, that would fit within ourselves?
As a secular social psychologist, the answer that he gives is that being groupish, that's his word, being groupish actually helps keep the species going.
Oh, sure.
And because we can't simply have a loyalty to a group that is too large, we tend to focus on people who have a closer connection to us, and we tend to stick with those people.
Oh.
So, the size of a family, the size of a neighborhood, the size of a tribe, for example. So now, obviously, I would advance the further claim, not negating what he's saying, but the further claim is we are created from a communion of persons for a communion of persons. So we don't just owe it to each other as a matter of justice, of rendering what is due, to try to understand each other and to cooperate because we're social animals. But actually, because we're created in the image and likeness of God, because God himself in our flesh says, what we do to the least, we do to him, we are obligated by divine command and in the wise and loving providence of God to attempt to enter into how the other person is understanding reality and to discerning this together in charity.
So, the homework for this episode is to read this book, of course.
The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion.
And we are in no way supported financially by Jonathon Haidt.
No, I get no royalties here. I mean, Chris, just to maybe end with this, every 4 years in our nation, and I've been a priest for 22 years, so I've gone through lots of election cycles. I find it fascinating that the first people to contact me about what I should do are the people angriest that I am not condemning other candidates.
Sure.
They're not saying, well, why aren't you endorsing so-and-so? They are furious that the person that they loathe the most
not being condemned.
is not being condemned with sufficient clarity. And with that goes an incomprehension of why large groups of people would be more drawn to support one candidate, or even more interestingly, why they would fear the other candidate so much. I mean, in the current system we have, I would go so far to say is most people are not voting for a candidate because they endorse this candidate's vision of reality. I mean, there are some on either side, but I think most people, when they go in the ballot box to cast the vote, let's just say the level of, the leadership of the nation, they are voting against what they consider to be the scariest of the two. And it's worth probing why people have those fears on both sides. On both sides.
But it feels like, listening to you, this is much bigger than elections. That really, I mean, you've just described Thanksgiving dinner for a lot of families.
Yes.
That can be a horrible event.
Yes.
Because even if it's our own family members, we tend to demonize that with which we disagree.
Christopher, let me go autobiographical here. So I phone my mom and dad every Sunday, dutiful son that I attempt to be. And my mom and dad are what I would call standard consumers of standard American media.
They didn't get the 90%.
And they spend hours daily consuming this. And so, their favorite hobby at this point is, just marveling at how the ones that they disagree with could possibly be doing what they're doing. And so this plays out in our family. I have some members of my family who, with a particular political candidate, cannot stand this person. And other people, it's the reverse in my family. And the round and round. And my mom, after my most recent conversation with her, she admitted at the end of the call, just as an aside, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself once this election's over, because it's become a kind of soap opera. And I don't want to trivialize this because, in many ways, the future course of the nation, is going to be set by who we choose for and who we choose against. And And that's always the case,
Right.
despite the rhetoric of, this is the most decisive election in the history of the republic.
But this came in full view during the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
So families were splitting apart over those who opposed the vaccine or those who promoted the vaccine.
Yes.
And we demonized those with whom we disagree.
Yes.
It is in our nature to do that.
Yeah. And to understand the different reactions to the plague, as I call it, this book is really, really helpful. How for some people, it just came down to taking care of the sick and trying to prevent harm.
At the cost of liberty, perhaps.
And for other people, the liberties that were being sacrificed and the deference to authority that was being given was the greater harm. So
it really fits within that
this
construct.
book will not actually help to adjudicate principles. And I want to make that clear because if we just stopped our podcast with the recommendation of this book, we would be stuck in a kind of relativism of principles. And I do believe there is a hierarchy of principles, and we will go into those in another podcast. But unless and until we make a really principled attempt to understand the sensitivities and pre-rational priorities along these spectra of where people are coming from, we are going to be talking at cross purposes, and we will continue living alienated from each other on the deepest questions and being alienated from our own shared life. And that is contrary to the law and love of God.
Well, we look forward to the next episode.
Stay tuned.
We'll dive into that in more detail.
Great.
Well, viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. I hope you're not intimidated by your reading assignment, but you do have a lot of free time now since you're 90% off the news.
You could even bring this book into the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at the Oratory of St. Mary Magdalene if you want, if you're constantly bringing this to prayer before the Lord Jesus.
Well, thank you for joining us, listeners. We hope that you have enjoyed this. If there are other topics you'd like to hear Father talk about, he would love to know about that. You can contact us at church@stv.org. You can message me directly if you'd like. It's 260-450-8878. If you'll put after the homily in the message, that would just be terrific. But we would love to hear from you. But thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to being with you again soon with the next episode of After the Homily with Father Daniel Schiedt.